I stood in the middle of their laughter, holding a tray of their favorite canapés, and realized something was wrong. Terribly wrong. They called me the maid again, as if my 8 years in this house meant nothing. My hands trembled, but my heart screamed a question I couldn't ignore. Who am I in this house? I stayed quiet, not because I had no choice. I was waiting. Welcome to the Betrayal Revenge channel, where stories come alive through voices you've never heard told this way before. Stay with us for a story of justice and rebirth. It all began 3 months ago, on a crisp San Diego evening. I'll never forget. The chandelier in the dining room cast a golden glow, its light fracturing into tiny prisms across the polished mahogany table. The air smelled of rosemary and melted butter, mingling with the faint tang of champagne bubbles. Laughter spilled from the living room, sharp and carefree, as Rachel's engagement party unfolded in full swing. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, my hands slick with olive oil, arranging canapés on a silver tray. The delicate pastry shells, each cradling a perfect swirl of crab mousse, had taken me hours to prepare. My back ached from bending over the counter, my fingers stiff from piping, but it was worth it, or so I told myself. I smoothed my apron, the same one I'd worn for years, its edges frayed from countless washes. The mirror by the kitchen door caught my reflection. Gray streaks in my hair, lines etched deep around my eyes. 60 years old, and I still moved through this house like a ghost, unseen unless something needed doing. I pushed the thought away. Tonight was Rachel's night, Martin's daughter from his first marriage, radiant at 35, with her sharp cheekbones and sharper ambition. She deserved this moment, didn't she? And I, Lorraine, the second wife, would make it perfect for her. The tray felt heavier than it should as I stepped into the living room. The crowd parted slightly, their voices a low hum of chatter and clinking glasses. Rachel stood at the center, her fiancé's arm around her waist, her laughter bright as the diamond on her finger. Martin was there too, his broad shoulders filling out a tailored blazer, his smile easy and practiced. He caught my eye for a moment, but it was fleeting, like a breeze that doesn't linger. I set the tray on the buffet table, careful not to disturb the floral centerpiece, a cascade of white roses I'd arranged at dawn. "Thank you, Lorraine," Rachel said, her voice smooth, almost sweet. She barely glanced at me, her eyes already drifting back to her guests. "The canapés are a little dry, though. Maybe next time, more cream in the mousse?" Her words landed like a pinprick, sharp and precise. I froze, my smile stiffening. Dry? I'd tasted every batch myself, adjusted the seasoning until it was perfect. My throat tightened, but I nodded, murmuring, "Of course, Rachel." She didn't hear me. She was already turning away, her silk dress catching the light as she laughed at something her fiancé said. I stood there, the tray empty now, my hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. The room buzzed around me, guests in their pressed suits and glittering dresses, their voices weaving a tapestry I wasn't part of. I caught snippets of their chatter, stock portfolios, vacation homes, Rachel's latest deal at her consulting firm. No one asked about the canapés. No one asked about me. I retreated to the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind me, muffling the noise. The counter was a battlefield of dirty bowls and spilled flour, the sink overflowing with pans. My chest felt heavy, like I'd swallowed something I couldn't digest. Dry. That word clung to me, burrowing under my skin. It wasn't just about the food. It was about me, how they saw me, how they'd always seen me. 8 years in this house, and I was still Lorraine, the help. Not Martin's wife, not Rachel's stepmother. Just the woman who cooked, cleaned, and faded into the background. I leaned against the counter, the cool marble grounding me. My mind drifted to the early days with Martin, when his charm had felt like sunlight. He'd called me his partner, his equal. "This house is ours," he'd said, his hand warm in mine as we walked through the sprawling halls of this San Diego estate. But the deed never bore my name. "It's complicated," he'd explained, his voice gentle but firm. "Family assets from before we met. You understand, don't you?" And I had. I'd nodded, smiled, and buried my doubts, because love was supposed to be enough. Now, standing in this kitchen, I wasn't so sure. The memory felt like a photograph left too long in the sun, faded, unreliable. I glanced at the stack of RSVPs on the counter, each one addressed to Martin and family. My name wasn't there. It never was. The weight of that absence pressed against my ribs, sharp and unyielding. The kitchen door swung open, and Rachel's voice cut through my thoughts. "Lorraine, we're out of champagne flutes. Can you grab more from the cellar? Oh, and the dessert tray needs refreshing." She didn't wait for a reply, her heels clicking as she disappeared back into the crowd. I stared at the door, my pulse thudding in my ears. "Can you grab more?" Not a question, but a command, delivered with the casual arrogance of someone who knew I'd obey. I wanted to scream, to throw the tray across the room and let it shatter, but I didn't. I never did. Instead, I wiped my hands on my apron, took a breath, and headed for the cellar. The stairs creaked under my weight, the air growing cooler with each step. The cellar smelled of damp stone and aged oak, the shelves lined with Martin's prized wine collection. I found the flutes, their crystal edges glinting in the dim light. As I gathered them, my reflection flickered in the glass, a woman who'd spent years polishing someone else's life, only to be called Maid. Back upstairs, I set the flutes on the bar, my movements mechanical. The party had grown louder, the guests more animated. Martin was holding court near the fireplace, his deep laugh echoing. Rachel was beside him, her hand on his arm, her smile a mirror of his. They looked like a family, a real one. And I was the shadow in the corner, holding a tray no one noticed until it was empty. Then it happened. A small moment, but it cut deeper than anything else that night. Rachel's fiancé, a man with a slick smile and a Rolex that caught the light, turned to me as I passed with the dessert tray. "You're a godsend, Lorraine," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Martin's lucky to have such a dedicated maid." Maid. The word hit me like a slap, stealing the air from my lungs. I stood frozen, the tray trembling in my hands. The room seemed to tilt, the laughter growing distant like I was underwater. Martin was just a few feet away, close enough to hear. I waited for him to correct the man, to say, "She's my wife." But he didn't. He met my gaze for a split second, then looked away, his smile never faltering as he raised his glass to a guest. My vision blurred, not with tears but with something hotter, sharper. I set the tray down, my fingers numb, and slipped back to the kitchen. The door closed behind me, and I pressed my hands to my face, breathing hard. The question I'd been avoiding for years clawed its way to the surface, refusing to be ignored. Who am I in this house? Not a wife, not a mother, not even a person, it seemed. Just a shadow, expected to serve and disappear. I looked around the kitchen, the place where I'd spent countless hours, where I'd poured my love into every dish, every detail. This house, with its high ceilings and manicured gardens, was supposed to be my home. But it wasn't. It never had been. And as I stood there, the weight of that truth settled over me, heavy and unshakable. What hurt most wasn't the word maid. It was the silence that followed, the silence of a husband who let it stand, of a stepdaughter who didn't care, of a life I'd built that didn't belong to me. I straightened, my jaw tight, and picked up a sponge to scrub the counter. But my mind was racing, circling a new question, one that felt dangerous and alive. If I'm not their maid, then who am I? Something was off about Martin's smile that night, the way it never quite reached his eyes. I'd seen it before, but standing there in the aftermath of Rachel's engagement party, it hit me harder. He'd let them call me Maid, let the word hang in the air like it was nothing. And now, as I watched him move through our home, I couldn't shake the question, was I ever more than a convenience to him? The morning after the party, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the living room, glinting off the crystal chandelier and pooling on the hardwood floor. The air still carried a faint trace of last night's champagne, now sour and stale. I stood at the sink, scrubbing the last of the dessert plates, the water scalding my hands. My apron was damp, clinging to my thighs, and my shoulders ached from hours of cleaning up the chaos Rachel's guests had left behind. Martin was in the dining room, his voice low and steady as he spoke on the phone. I couldn't make out the words, just the rhythm, confident, controlled, the way he always sounded when he was closing a deal. I glanced through the open doorway, catching sight of him leaning back in his chair, one hand adjusting his glasses. At 65, he still carried himself like a man who knew the room belonged to him. His silver hair was neatly combed, his shirt crisp despite the early hour. To anyone else, he was the picture of success. To me, he was a puzzle I'd spent 8 years trying to solve. I dried my hands on a dish towel, the rough fabric scratching my skin, and walked toward the dining room. My steps were soft, almost instinctive, as if I didn't want to disturb the air around him. "Martin," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be, "can we talk about last night?" He didn't look up from his phone, his thumb scrolling through emails. "What about it?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, like I'd interrupted something important. I hesitated, my fingers twisting the towel. The memory of Rachel's fiancé calling me Maid burned in my chest, but what hurt more was Martin's silence. When he said what he did, you didn't correct him." My words came out halting, careful. "You let him think I was just the help." Martin sighed, setting his phone down with a deliberate slowness. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, and fixed me with a look that made my stomach twist. "Lorraine, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. It was a party. People say things. You're too sensitive." His voice was smooth, almost kind, but it carried a weight that pinned me in place. "Too sensitive?" I echoed, my voice sharper now. "Martin, I'm your wife. I've been running this house for years, and you let them." "Let them what?" He cut in, his eyes narrowing. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You know how Rachel's crowd is. They're young, careless. You can't take it personally." He leaned back, folding his arms. "Besides, you did a great job last night. The food was fine. Everyone had a good time." "Fine." The words stung, reducing hours of my labor to something barely worth mentioning. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me, a look that said I was crossing a line, that I should know better than to push. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, and nodded. "Okay," I murmured, turning back to the kitchen. But as I walked away, my hands clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms. Fine wasn't enough anymore. That afternoon, Rachel came by with her wedding planner, a woman with a clipboard and a voice like a metronome. They sat at the dining table, surrounded by fabric swatches and seating charts, while I cleared away lunch dishes. Martin joined them, his presence shifting the room's energy. He was all charm, offering suggestions, making Rachel laugh with his dry humor. I lingered in the background, wiping down the counter, listening as they discussed floral arrangements and guest lists. "Lorraine," Rachel called without looking up, "can you make us some coffee? And maybe those lemon scones you do? The planner hasn't tried them yet." Her tone was light, but it carried the same assumption as always, that I'd drop everything to serve her. I froze, the sponge in my hand dripping onto the counter. My eyes flicked to Martin, waiting for him to say something, anything. But he just nodded at me, a subtle gesture that felt like a command. "Go on, Lorraine," he said, his voice low. "You know how much Rachel loves those scones." My chest tightened, a familiar ache spreading through me. I wanted to refuse, to tell them to make their own damn coffee. But the weight of Martin's gaze held me in place, his unspoken expectation heavier than any words. I set the sponge down, wiped my hands, and headed to the pantry. As I measured out flour, my mind churned. Why does it always feel like I'm asking for permission to exist in my own home? Later that evening, the house was quiet again, the wedding planner long gone. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when Martin came in. He leaned against the doorway, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "You're upset," he said, not a question but a statement. I kept my eyes on the cutting board, the knife moving faster than necessary. I don't understand why you don't stand up for me. Rachel treats me like a servant, and you let her." He sighed, crossing his arms. "Lorraine, Rachel's under a lot of stress with the wedding. She doesn't mean anything by it. And you're good at what you do. Keeping this house running, it's important. Don't turn it into something it's not." Good at what you do. The words should have been a compliment, but they felt like chains. I set the knife down, my hands trembling. "And what am I to you, Martin? Your wife? Or just someone who makes your life easier?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might snap. But then his face softened, and he stepped closer, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You're my wife," he said, his voice low, almost tender. "You know that. This house, this family, it's complicated. There's history here, things from before you came. I need you to trust me." His touch was warm, his words carefully chosen, and for a fleeting moment I wanted to believe him. But as he turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of his phone screen, left open on the counter, an email half visible with the subject line, "Property transfer, Rachel's trust." My heart skipped a beat. Property? This house? The one he'd always said was family assets I wasn't part of? I stood there, the knife still in my hand, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. The pieces didn't fit, not yet, but the edges were sharp, cutting into the trust I'd clung to for so long. Martin's voice echoed in my mind, "Trust me," but it was drowned out by a new question, one that felt like a spark in the dark. Did he marry me for love, or because I was easy to control? The email on Martin's phone haunted me, its words burned into my mind. Property transfer, Rachel's trust. It was just a glimpse, but it felt like a crack in the wall I'd been leaning against for years. I kept moving through the house, cleaning, cooking, smiling when I had to, but something inside me had shifted. A question was growing, quiet but relentless. What if this house, this life, isn't theirs to control? The days after Rachel's engagement party blurred into a rhythm of routine. The San Diego sun rose sharp and unrelenting, its light spilling through the tall windows of the estate, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The house smelled of lemon polish and fresh laundry, scents I'd woven into its walls over 8 years. But no matter how much I scrubbed, the unease clung to me, heavy as the damp towels I folded each morning. It was a Thursday, gray and overcast, when I found myself in the storage room off the garage. Martin had asked me to clear out old boxes. "Declutter," he'd said, his tone casual, as if it were just another task on my endless list. The room was a maze of cardboard and forgotten things. Rachel's old school trophies, Martin's golf clubs, stacks of yellowed paperwork. The air was thick with dust, tickling my throat as I pulled boxes from the shelves. My hands moved mechanically, sorting, stacking, until my fingers brushed against a leather-bound folder tucked behind a crate of Christmas decorations. I paused, the weight of it unfamiliar in my hands. The folder was heavy, its edges worn but intact, embossed with the initials of Martin's family crest. My pulse quickened, a faint prickle of instinct telling me to open it. I glanced toward the door, half expecting Martin to appear, but the house was silent. I untied the clasp and flipped it open. Inside were documents, neatly organized, their pages crisp despite their age. Property records, deeds, tax filings, all tied to the estate we lived in. My eyes scanned the text, catching phrases like sole beneficiary and premarital assets. My breath caught when I saw my name, scrawled in faint ink on a yellowed addendum dated 8 years ago, just after our wedding. It was a power of attorney, granting me co-ownership of the estate in the event of Martin's incapacitation. The words blurred as I read them again, my heart pounding. Co-ownership. Not just a wife, not just a shadow. I had a claim. But there was more. Another document, newer, caught my eye. It was a draft of a trust agreement naming Rachel as the primary beneficiary of the estate. The date was recent, 3 months ago. Martin's signature was there, bold and unmistakable, but mine was absent. My hands trembled as I turned the page, finding a handwritten note in Martin's precise script. Finalize transfer before wedding. Keep Lorraine out. The room seemed to tilt, the air too thin. I pressed a hand to my chest, steadying myself against the shelf. Keep Lorraine out. The words echoed, sharp and cold, slicing through the fog of my denial. Martin hadn't just overlooked me. He was erasing me, rewriting the story of this house to exclude me entirely. And yet, the older document, the one with my name, suggested I wasn't as powerless as he thought. I closed the folder, my fingers lingering on the leather. The question that had been simmering since the party flared into something new. Am I sitting on something they think is theirs? I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, I felt the weight of possibility, fragile but real. I slipped the folder into an empty box, covering it with old linens, and carried it to my bedroom. The house was still quiet. Martin out at a meeting, Rachel at her office. I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking as I opened the folder again. The documents were a maze of legal jargon, but I forced myself to read every line, my lips moving silently as I pieced it together. The estate had been inherited by Martin from his parents after our marriage, making it community property under California law. But the trust he was setting up for Rachel? It relied on the assumption that I had no claim. The power of attorney, buried and forgotten, was a loophole, a crack in his carefully laid plans. My mind raced, memories flooding back. Martin's insistence that the house was family property, his vague promises that I'd be taken care of. The way he'd brush off my questions about finances, saying, "You don't need to worry about that, Lorraine. That's why you have me." I'd trusted him, let his words lull me into complacency, but now, staring at these papers, I saw the truth. He'd been playing a long game, and I was never meant to be a player. I needed answers, but I couldn't confront him, not yet. I grabbed my phone and searched for the name of the family's old attorney, a man Martin had mentioned years ago. His office was still listed in La Jolla, a short drive away. My heart pounded as I dialed the number, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I'd like to schedule a consultation," I said, giving my name. "It's about a property matter." The receptionist was polite, booking me for the next day. I hung up, my hands clammy, and hid the folder under the mattress, a temporary measure until I could make copies. That night, as I prepared dinner, I moved through the kitchen with a strange calm. The familiar smells of garlic and thyme grounded me, but my mind was elsewhere, turning over the documents, the loophole, the possibility of reclaiming what was mine. Martin came home late, his briefcase in hand, his face etched with the faint strain of a long day. He kissed my cheek, a perfunctory gesture, and sat at the dining table. "Smells good," he said, unfolding his napkin. "Rachel's coming by tomorrow to go over more wedding plans. You'll handle breakfast, right?" I nodded, my smile automatic, but my eyes lingered on him a moment too long. Did he know I'd been in the storage room? Could he sense the shift in me, the spark of defiance I was fighting to keep hidden? "Of course," I said, setting a plate in front of him. But as I turned back to the stove, my thoughts were racing. I wasn't just cooking dinner anymore. I was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something they wouldn't see coming. That night, as Martin slept beside me, his breathing steady and untroubled, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The folder under the mattress felt like a secret heartbeat, pulsing with potential. I didn't know how far this would go, but I knew one thing. I wasn't invisible anymore, not to myself. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, a new question took root, sharp and unyielding. What else have they hidden from me? The folder under my mattress was a secret I carried like a blade, sharp and hidden, but not yet drawn. I thought I'd found a foothold, a way to reclaim my place in this house. But then she walked in. Diana with her soft smile and knowing eyes, and I realized the game wasn't just about property. It was about erasing me entirely. As I watched her glide through my home, a question clawed at my heart. When did they decide I was replaceable? The San Diego summer was relentless, the air thick with heat that clung to the skin like damp silk. Inside the estate, the air conditioning hummed, but it did little to cool the tension coiling in my chest. It had been a week since I found the documents, a week of stolen glances at Martin, of pretending I hadn't seen the words, "Keep Lorraine out." I moved through the house with a careful grace, my hands busy with chores, my mind a storm of plans. The attorney's appointment was tomorrow, and I'd already photocopied the key pages, tucking them into a locked drawer in my sewing room, but the weight of my secret was heavy, and the house felt smaller, its walls pressing in. It was a Saturday when Diana appeared, her arrival announced by the chime of the doorbell and Rachel's bright, "She's here!" I was in the kitchen, kneading dough for brioche, my fingers dusted with flour. The scent of yeast and butter filled the air, grounding me in the familiar rhythm of baking. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped into the foyer, curious but unprepared. Diana stood there, her presence like a soft breeze that shifts the room without warning. She was 64, a year older than me, but time had been kinder to her, or perhaps she'd had the means to negotiate with it. Her auburn hair was swept into a loose chignon, her linen dress flowing in shades of cream that caught the light. She smiled, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that felt practiced, and extended a hand. "Lorraine," she said, her voice smooth as honey, "it's been too long." I took her hand, my grip firmer than I intended, and murmured, "Diana, welcome." My mind raced, piecing together fragments of Martin's stories. Diana, Joanne, as he sometimes called her, was his first love, the one who'd left town decades ago before his first marriage. He'd spoken of her rarely, always with a wistful edge that I'd dismissed as nostalgia. But now, seeing her in my home, I felt a prickle of unease, like a shadow moving just out of sight. Rachel swept in, her energy bright and commanding. "Diana's here to help with the wedding," she said, looping her arm through Diana's. "She's a genius with PR. She's going to make sure my brand shines." Her eyes flicked to me, a quick assessment before she added, "Lorraine, can you set up the dining room? We're going over vendor contracts." I nodded, my throat tight, and turned back to the kitchen. But as I arranged plates and poured iced tea, I couldn't shake the image of Diana's smile, the way it seemed to claim the space around her. I carried a tray of glasses to the dining room, my steps measured, and caught snippets of their conversation, Rachel's animated plans, Diana's soft laughter, Martin's low, approving hum. They were a tableau of ease, a family I wasn't part of. The moment that broke me came later, at a small gathering Rachel hosted to finalize the wedding menu. The house was alive with guests, caterers, florists, Rachel's inner circle, all buzzing under the glow of string lights in the garden. I'd spent the day preparing tasting platters, my kitchen a whirlwind of chopped herbs and sizzling pans. Now, I stood at the edge of the patio, a tray of bruschetta in my hands, the scent of basil and tomato sharp in the warm air. My dress, a simple navy shift I'd chosen for its practicality, felt dowdy next to the silk and chiffon of the guests. Diana was there, seated at the head of the table, her posture elegant but relaxed. Martin sat beside her, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair. Rachel leaned in, showing Diana something on her phone, and the three of them laughed, their voices blending into a harmony that excluded me. I set the tray down, my movements quiet, and stepped back, my hands clasped to keep them still. No one noticed me. No one ever did. Then Elliot, Rachel's 6-year-old son, ran up, his face flushed from playing. He was a whirlwind of energy, his curls bouncing as he tugged at Diana's sleeve. "Miss Diana, look at my truck," he said, holding up a toy with a grin. She bent down, her smile radiant, and ruffled his hair. "That's the best truck I've ever seen, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm enough to melt butter. Elliot beamed, then turned and saw me. His smile faltered, and he stepped back, clutching the truck to his chest. "I like Miss Diana better," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "She's nicer." The words hit like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I stood frozen, the tray forgotten, as the chatter around me faded to a dull hum. My eyes darted to Martin, expecting, hoping for him to correct the boy, to say, "Lorraine's your grandmother." But he just chuckled, a low, dismissive sound, and sipped his wine. Diana's hand rested on Elliot's shoulder, her expression soft but triumphant, like a queen claiming a small victory. Rachel laughed, a sharp, careless sound. "Oh, Elliot, you're too cute," she said, then turned to Diana. "He's obsessed with you already." I turned away, my vision blurring, and retreated to the kitchen. The door swung shut behind me, muffling the laughter, but it couldn't silence the ache in my chest. I leaned against the counter, my hands gripping the edge, the cool marble grounding me. I like Miss Diana better. A child's words, but they carried the weight of truth. They didn't just want me gone, they wanted someone else in my place. My mind spiraled, pulling me back to the early days of my marriage. Martin had promised me a family, a home where I belonged. I'd poured myself into this house, into Rachel, into Elliot, believing love could bridge the gaps. But now, standing in this kitchen, I saw it clearly. I'd been a placeholder, a servant they could replace with someone who fit their vision better. Diana, with her polish and poise, was the upgrade they'd chosen. I thought of the folder, the power of attorney that gave me a claim to this house. It was a lifeline, but it wasn't enough, not when they were rewriting my role entirely. I needed to act, to protect what was mine before they pushed me out completely. But how? The attorney would have answers, I hoped, but until then, I had to keep playing my part, smiling through the pain. That night, as I cleared the patio, I overheard Martin and Diana by the garden. Their voices were low, intimate, the kind of tone he hadn't used with me in years. "You've always been good for Rachel," he said, his words soft but clear. "She needs someone like you, Joanne." Joanne. The name he'd once whispered with longing, now spoken in my home, to a woman who wasn't me. I stood in the shadows, the tray trembling in my hands, and felt something harden inside me. They thought they could erase me, replace me with her. But I wasn't gone yet. And as I turned back to the house, a new question burned, fierce and unyielding. How long have they been planning to take everything from me? Diana's laughter lingered in my mind, a sound that echoed through the house long after she left. It wasn't just her presence that unnerved me, it was how easily she fit, how seamlessly she slipped into the space I'd spent years carving out. The folder of documents was my secret weapon, but it wasn't enough to stop the ache of being replaced. As I stood in the kitchen, watching the world I'd built crumble, a new resolve took root, quiet but unshakable. The question wasn't, who am I anymore? It was, what happens when I stop being their shadow? The San Diego air was heavy with the promise of rain, the sky a bruised purple as evening settled over the estate. Inside, the house was a study in contrasts. Gleaming surfaces I'd polished to perfection, and attention that no amount of cleaning could erase. The wedding was a week away, and the estate buzzed with preparations. Caterers, florists, and Rachel's endless stream of assistants flowed in and out, their voices a constant hum that grated against my nerves. I moved through it all like a ghost, my hands busy with tasks, my mind locked on the plan I was building. The attorneys' meeting had been a revelation. Mr. Callahan, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, had studied the documents I'd brought, the power of attorney, the deed, the trust draft. "You've got a case," he'd said, his voice low but firm. "The estate is community property, and that power of attorney gives you leverage. Martin can't transfer it without your consent." He'd outlined the steps: file a claim, freeze the trust, demand transparency. It was a legal labyrinth, but for the first time I felt like I had a map. Now, standing in the kitchen, I chopped parsley with a steady hand, the knife's rhythm grounding me. The scent of garlic and olive oil filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of lemon from the dessert I'd prepared earlier. The counter was cluttered with ingredients for tomorrow's tasting menu, a task Rachel had delegated without a second thought. But tonight, I was cooking for myself, a small act of defiance, a reminder that I could still choose something for me. I glanced at the clock. 8:47 p.m. Martin was in his study, his door closed, the faint glow of his desk lamp seeping under the frame. Rachel was out with her bridesmaids, and the house felt oddly still, like it was holding its breath. I set the knife down and wiped my hands on my apron, my fingers brushing the frayed hem. It was the same apron I'd worn for years, a symbol of my role here, but tomorrow I'd wear something new. I'd gone shopping that morning, a rare act of indulgence. The boutique in La Jolla had been quiet, its racks lined with dresses that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. I'd chosen a tailored blazer and a silk blouse in a soft ivory, simple but elegant. The saleswoman had smiled, saying, "This suits you perfectly." I'd paid for it with my own card, not Martin's, and the small rebellion had felt like a spark. The outfit was folded in my closet now, waiting for the moment I'd need it, when I'd stand up and claim what was mine. Back in the kitchen, I opened my notebook, a worn leather journal I'd kept since my early days with Martin. It was filled with recipes, grocery lists, and the occasional scribbled thought, fragments of a life I'd let slip away. But tonight, I turned to a fresh page and began to write. The pen moved slowly at first, then faster, as the words poured out. I am Lorraine, wife of a man who forgot me, stepmother to a daughter who never saw me, grandmother to a boy who chose another. I am the keeper of this house, but not its servant. I am not invisible. The act of writing was like exhaling a breath I'd held for years. I titled the page, Lorraine's Story, the Wife of a Family That Never Named Me. It wasn't just a record, it was a declaration, a way to anchor myself before the storm I knew was coming. I wrote about the party, the word Maid, Diana's smile, the documents. I wrote about the ache of being unseen, the fury of being replaced. And as I wrote, I felt something shift inside me, a clarity, a strength I hadn't known I still had. The doorbell chimed, startling me. I closed the notebook and tucked it into a drawer, my heart racing. It was late for visitors. I smoothed my apron and opened the door to find one of Rachel's assistants, a young woman with a clipboard and a harried expression. "Lorraine, sorry to bother you," she said, breathless. "Rachel needs you to confirm the table settings for the wedding. Can you do it tonight? She's freaking out." I stared at her, the familiar weight of obligation pressing down. For a moment, I wanted to say no, to shut the door and let Rachel handle her own chaos. But I nodded, my voice steady. "I'll take care of it." The assistant thanked me and left, her footsteps fading into the night. I closed the door and leaned against it, my eyes stinging. One last time, I thought. I'll play their game one last time. I returned to the kitchen and pulled out the seating chart, my hands moving with a calm precision. The names blurred together, Rachel's friends, Martin's colleagues, Diana's carefully penned addition at the head table. I traced her name with my finger, the ink smudging slightly under my touch. She was everywhere now, woven into the fabric of this family like she'd never left. But I wasn't done yet. Before bed, I called the caterer, confirming the menu with a voice that didn't waver. "Everything's set for tomorrow," I said, my tone clipped. "I'll handle the rest." I hung up and turned to the mirror, studying my reflection. The lines around my eyes were deeper, my hair grayer, but there was a fire in my gaze I hadn't seen in years. I wasn't the woman who'd stood silently at the engagement party. I was someone new, someone ready to fight. As I slipped into bed, Martin stirred, his voice groggy. "Everything okay?" he asked, not opening his eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Everything's fine." But inside, I was a storm gathering strength. The folder, the attorney, the blazer in my closet, they were pieces of a plan I was building step by careful step. Tomorrow, I'd prepare the wedding breakfast, smile for Rachel's guests, and play my role one last time. But I wasn't retreating. I was preparing. I closed my eyes, the question from earlier sharpening into focus. How will they react when I step out of the shadows? The answer was coming, and I was ready to find out. I'd carried their lies like a weight for years, letting them call me Maid, letting them replace me with Diana's polished charm. But at Rachel's wedding, with the folder of documents burning a hole in my purse, I knew it was time. As Martin raised his glass to give away my home, I felt a fire ignite inside me. The question wasn't whether I could fight. It was, what will they do when I shatter their perfect lie? The San Diego dawn was a blaze of gold, the estate transformed into a wedding dreamscape. White roses cascaded over trellises, their petals catching the morning light, while silk drapes fluttered in the breeze. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and champagne, a sweetness that clashed with the knot in my stomach. I moved through the house like a shadow, arranging platters of fruit and pastries for the bridal party, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. Today was Rachel's wedding, but it was also my reckoning. I wore the ivory blouse and blazer I'd bought, the silk cool against my skin, a quiet armor. My reflection in the hall mirror showed a woman carved by years of silence, gray hair, lined face, but eyes sharp with resolve. My purse held the photocopied documents, the power of attorney, the deed, my proof. My notebook, tucked beside them, held my story, a vow to myself. Today I'd stop being invisible. The wedding unfolded like a choreographed ballet. Guests filled the garden, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of a string quartet. Rachel was a vision in her lace gown, her smile radiant as she floated through the crowd. Martin stood tall in his tuxedo, his charm a polished weapon, while Diana hovered nearby, her cream dress a subtle claim to her place. Elliot darted between tables, his bow tie crooked, giggling as Diana handed him a macaron. They were a perfect family portrait, without me. I stood at the edge of the reception, a tray of champagne flutes in my hands, my presence unnoticed by guests who saw only the sparkle of the day. My heart pounded as Martin took the stage, his voice warm and commanding through the microphone. "Today we celebrate love," he said, his smile dazzling. "And as a gift to Rachel and her new husband, I'm transferring ownership of this estate to them, a legacy for our family." The crowd erupted in cheers, glasses clinking, but my blood turned to ice. Transferring ownership. The words were a betrayal, a final erasure of my place in this house. My hands trembled, the flutes rattling on the tray. I set it down, my movements deliberate, and stepped forward, my heels clicking on the stone path. The world slowed, the music fading to a distant hum as I raised my voice. "Martin," I said, clear and unwavering, cutting through the applause. Heads turned, gasps rippling through the crowd. Martin's smile faltered, his eyes locking onto mine with a flash of alarm. Rachel froze, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Diana's hand fluttered to her throat, her composure cracking. I reached into my purse, pulling out the documents, their edges worn but undeniable. "You can't give away what isn't yours alone," I said, my voice steady, each word a stone dropped into still water. I held up the power of attorney, its faded ink a lifeline. "This estate is community property under California law. Half of it is mine. And this," I lifted the document higher, "gives me co-ownership. You forgot to update it, Martin. You thought you could erase me, but you can't." The silence was absolute, a void swallowing the crowd's murmurs. Martin's face was a mask of shock, his knuckles white around the microphone. Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears, her lips parting in a silent sob. Diana stood rigid, her gaze darting to Martin, searching for a script that wasn't there. The crowd shifted, whispers rising like a tide. "What's happening? Who is she?" "Lorraine," Martin said, his voice low, a growl laced with warning. "This is not the place." "It's the only place," I countered, my voice rising, fierce and unyielding. "For 8 years I've been your wife, your cook, your servant. You let them call me Maid. Let Rachel treat me like one. Let Diana walk into my home like she belonged." I turned to Rachel, my heart aching but resolute. "I'm not here to take your happiness. I'm here to reclaim mine. I'm not asking for anything I'm not owed, just the place you tried to erase me from." Rachel's sob broke the silence, her bouquet falling to the grass. "You're ruining my wedding," she cried, her voice raw. "Why can't you just leave us alone?" Her words cut, but I stood taller, the document steady in my hand. "I'm not ruining you, Rachel," I said, my voice softer but firm. "I'm saving me." I faced the crowd, their faces a blur of shock and curiosity. "I've been silent too long. This house, this life, it's mine too, and I'm done letting you pretend it's not." Martin's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a fury I'd never seen. He stepped forward, the microphone slipping from his hand, clattering to the stage. "Lorraine, enough," he hissed, but his voice lacked its usual command, unraveling under the weight of my truth. Diana moved next, her voice soft but sharp, a knife wrapped in silk. "Lorraine, please, let's discuss this privately. You're upsetting Rachel on her day." I met her gaze, my eyes blazing. "No, Diana, you don't get to play the saint. You walked into my family, took my place, and smiled while doing it." This ends here." The crowd was a sea of stunned faces, some whispering, others frozen, their glasses forgotten in their hands. Elliot, confused, clung to his mother, his eyes wide. Rachel collapsed into her fiancé's arms, her sobs echoing. Martin stood motionless, his authority crumbling. Diana's lips parted, but no words came, her poise shattered. I lowered the documents, my chest heaving, but my spine straight. The truth was out, a wildfire I'd set free. I didn't know what would follow, lawsuits, accusations, or silence, but I'd done it. I'd stepped into the light, and there was no going back. As I turned to walk away, the crowd parting like a tide, a new question burned, sharp and alive. What will they do now that their lie is exposed? The silence after my outburst at the wedding was louder than any scream. I'd ripped their perfect facade apart, documents in hand, my voice steady as I claimed my place. But as I walked away from the stunned crowd, Martin's fury and Rachel's tears burned into my memory. They'd expected me to stay quiet, to fade away. Now, with the truth laid bare, a new question simmered, fierce and unyielding. Did they think I'd give them a chance to rewrite me out again? The San Diego evening settled over the estate like a heavy curtain, the air cool and damp with the threat of rain. The wedding had unraveled into chaos after my speech. Guests whispering, Rachel sobbing, Martin's face a mask of barely contained rage. I'd left the garden, my heels sinking into the grass, and retreated to the house, my purse clutched tight, the documents inside a shield I wasn't ready to lower. The fairy lights still twinkled outside, but their glow felt mocking now, a reminder of the celebration I'd shattered. I stood in the kitchen, the heart of the home I'd tended for 8 years. The counter was cluttered with half-empty trays of hors d'oeuvres, the air thick with the lingering scent of rosemary and spilled wine. My blazer hung neatly on a chair, but my hands were raw from gripping the documents, my knuckles white. I poured a glass of water, the cool liquid steadying me, and leaned against the sink, staring at the darkened window. My reflection stared back, tired, resolute, a woman who'd finally spoken. The door swung open, and Martin stormed in, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his tie loose. His eyes were dark, his jaw set, and for a moment I felt the old instinct to shrink, to apologize. But I held my ground, my spine straight, my gaze meeting his. "What the hell was that, Lorraine?" he demanded, his voice low, a growl that vibrated through the room. "You humiliated us in front of everyone, on Rachel's wedding day." I set the glass down, my movements deliberate. "Humiliated you?" I said, my voice calm but edged with steel. "You were going to give away my home, Martin, without a word, without my consent. You humiliated me for years, and I let you. Not anymore." His hands clenched into fists, his face flushing. "This is about the house? You think you're entitled to it? After everything I've done for you?" He stepped closer, his voice rising. "I gave you a life here, Lorraine, a family, and this is how you repay me?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that surprised even me. "A life? You gave me a role, Martin. Cook, cleaner, servant. You let Rachel call me Maid, let Diana waltz in like she belonged, and you thought I wouldn't notice you rewriting me out of this house?" I gestured to the purse on the counter, the documents inside. "I found the trust draft. Keep Lorraine out. Your words, not mine." His eyes flickered, a flash of guilt quickly buried under anger. "You went through my things?" he snapped. "You're paranoid, Lorraine. That trust was for Rachel's future, not to hurt you. You're blowing this out of proportion." "Don't," I said, my voice cutting through his. "Don't lie to me anymore. I have the power of attorney. I have the law on my side. This house is community property, and you can't take it from me." He stared at me, his breath heavy, and for a moment I thought he might lunge, not with fists but with words, the kind that had always kept me in line. But then the door opened again, and Rachel stepped in, her wedding gown stained with grass, her mascara streaked from crying. Her eyes were red, her voice raw. "How could you do this to me?" she said, her words trembling. "This was my day, Lorraine, my wedding, and you ruined it." I turned to her, my heart aching despite my resolve. Rachel, the girl I'd tried to love, the woman who'd never seen me as more than a servant. "I didn't want to hurt you, Rachel," I said, my voice softer but firm. "But I'm not invisible. I'm not your maid. I'm your father's wife, and this house is half mine. You don't get to erase me because it's convenient." She shook her head, tears spilling. "You're selfish," she spat. "You're tearing us apart over a house? After everything Dad's done for you? You're nothing without him." Her words stung, but I didn't flinch. "Nothing?" I said, my voice steady. "I've kept this house running for years. I've cooked your meals, cleaned your messes, raised your son when you were too busy. I'm not nothing, Rachel. I'm just done pretending I am." Martin stepped between us, his hand raised as if to silence me. "Enough," he said, his voice sharp. "Lorraine, you've made your point, but this isn't over. You think you can wave some papers and take everything? You're out of your depth." I met his gaze unflinching. "Try me," I said, my words a quiet challenge. "I've already spoken to an attorney. I know my rights, do you?" The air crackled with tension, the three of us locked in a standoff. Rachel's sobs quieted, her eyes darting between me and Martin, searching for the control they'd always had. Martin's face was a storm, but he didn't speak, his silence a crack in his armor. I picked up my purse, the documents inside a weight I carried with pride now, and turned to leave. "Lorraine," Martin called, his voice softer, almost pleading. "We can talk about this. You don't have to do it this way." I paused, my hand on the door, and looked back at him. His eyes held a flicker of the man I'd once loved, the one who'd promised me a home. But that man was gone, buried under years of manipulation. "You had 8 years to talk," I said, my voice steady. "You chose silence. Now it's my turn to speak." I walked out, the kitchen door swinging shut behind me. The house was quiet, the wedding chaos fading into the night. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, my steps slow but sure, and locked the door. The notebook lay on my nightstand, its pages filled with my truth. I opened it, my pen moving across a new page. They asked for a chance, but they never gave me one. Now, I'm taking what's mine. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, washing away the remnants of the day. I sat on the edge of the bed, the documents beside me, and felt a strange calm. I'd given them no warning, no chance to prepare, because they'd never given me one. And as I looked out at the rain-slicked estate, a new question took shape, bold and unapologetic. What will they do when they realize I'm not backing down? The rain fell harder after the wedding, drumming against the windows like a heartbeat I could finally hear. I'd stood up, documents in hand, and torn their lies apart. Martin's anger, Rachel's tears, they thought they could pull me back into the shadows. But as I sat in my locked bedroom, the folder beside me, I felt a fire they couldn't extinguish. The question wasn't whether I'd fight. It was, how far will they go to stop me now that I'm no longer theirs to control? The San Diego morning was gray, the estate shrouded in mist that clung to the roses and draped the lawn in silence. The wedding's aftermath lingered, scattered petals trampled into the grass, empty champagne flutes forgotten on tables. I moved through the house with purpose, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The kitchen, once my sanctuary, felt different now, its counters bare, the air free of the usual scents of baking bread or simmering herbs. I'd stopped cooking for them. That part of me was done. I wore a simple gray dress, its clean lines a quiet rebellion against the frayed apron I'd shed. My purse held the documents, my notebook, and a new addition, a letter from my attorney, Mr. Callahan, confirming my claim to the estate. He'd filed a motion to freeze the trust transfer, citing the power of attorney and community property laws. The legal wheels were turning, and I was no longer just a wife or a servant. I was a force they hadn't anticipated. Martin was in the dining room when I came downstairs, his coffee untouched, his laptop open. His eyes flicked to me, sharp and wary, like a man sizing up an opponent. "Lorraine," he said, his voice low, controlled. "We need to talk." I paused, my hand resting on the back of a chair, my posture straight. "I'm listening," I said, my tone even but unyielding, "but don't expect me to back down." He leaned back, folding his arms, his face a mix of frustration and something softer. Regret, maybe, but I didn't trust it. "You're making a mistake," he said. "This stunt at the wedding, these papers, the lawyer, it's tearing the family apart. Rachel's devastated. Elliot's confused. Is that what you want?" His words were a calculated jab, meant to pierce my resolve, but I'd heard them before. I sat across from him, my hands clasped, my gaze steady. "What I want," I said, "is to be seen. For 8 years, I've been your wife in name only, running this house while you and Rachel treated me like hired help. You tried to give my home away, Martin. Don't talk to me about family." His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching. "You're twisting this," he said. "The trust was for Rachel's future, not to cut you out. You're blowing it out of proportion, like always." He leaned forward, his voice softening, a tactic I recognized. "We can fix this, Lorraine. Drop the lawyer. Let's settle it privately. You don't want this fight." I smiled, a small bitter curve of my lips. "You're right, I don't want to fight, but I'm done negotiating my worth. I found the trust draft, Martin. Keep Lorraine out. Your words. You don't get to rewrite that now." His eyes darkened, but before he could respond, the doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. I rose, my movements calm, and opened the door to find Rachel, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She wore a loose sweater, her hair pulled back, a far cry from the radiant bride of yesterday. "Lorraine," she said, her voice trembling, "can we talk? Please?" I stepped aside, letting her in, my heart a tangle of pity and resolve. She followed me to the living room where Martin joined us, his presence heavy. Rachel sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I've been distant, but I didn't mean to hurt you. This house, the trust, it's for Elliot, for his future. Why are you making it so hard?" Her words were soft, but they carried an edge, a subtle accusation. I sat across from her, my hands steady. "Rachel," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "I raised Elliot when you were working late. I cooked for you, cleaned for you, loved you like my own, and you called me Maid. You let Diana take my place without a second thought. I'm not making this hard. You did when you decided I was disposable." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't waver. Martin interjected, his voice sharp. "Lorraine, enough. You're upsetting her. Let's be reasonable. What do you want? Money? A settlement? Name it." I turned to him, my eyes blazing. "I want my life back," I said, my voice rising, each word a declaration. "I want the years I spent believing I was your partner, not your servant. I want the home I've earned, not stolen from me. And I want you to stop acting like I'm the one who broke this family when you've been dismantling me for years." The room fell silent, the weight of my words settling like dust. Rachel's sobs were quiet now, her face buried in her hands. Martin stared at me, his control slipping, his eyes searching for a crack in my resolve, but there was none. I stood, picking up my purse, the documents inside a reminder of my power. "I filed a claim," I said, my voice steady. "The trust is frozen. My attorney will handle the rest. You can fight me in court, but I'm not backing down." I looked at Rachel, my heart heavy but resolute. "I didn't want to hurt you, Rachel, but I'm done being hurt." I walked to the door, my steps sure, but Martin's voice stopped me. "Lorraine," he said, his tone softer, almost desperate, "you're throwing everything away. We could have worked this out." I turned, my hand on the knob, and met his gaze. "You threw me away first," I said, my voice quiet but piercing. "Now you get to live with it." Outside, the mist had lifted, the estate glowing under a weak sun. I climbed into my car, the engine humming to life, and drove to Mr. Callahan's office. The folder sat on the passenger seat, a testament to my fight. I didn't know how long the battle would last, but I'd already won something they couldn't take: my voice. And as I pulled onto the highway, a new question burned, bold and unapologetic. What will they do when they see I'm not afraid anymore? I'd torn their world apart. my voice shattering the lies they'd built around me. Martin's control, Rachel's entitlement, Diana's calculated charm. They'd all crumbled under the weight of my truth. But as I drove away from the estate, the documents beside me, I felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve. The question wasn't whether I'd won. It was, what happens when the man who orchestrated it all has nothing left to manipulate? The San Diego sky was a muted gray, the air heavy with the aftermath of rain. The estate faded in my rearview mirror, its manicured lawns and towering windows a distant memory as I navigated the coastal highway. My hands gripped the steering wheel, the leather cool under my palms, grounding me in the moment. The folder of documents sat on the passenger seat, its edges worn but its power undeniable. My attorney's letter tucked inside was a lifeline, a legal tether to the home I'd claimed as mine. I'd spent the morning at Mr. Callahan's office signing papers to formalize my claim. The trust transfer was frozen, the estate locked in limbo until the courts could rule. "You've got a strong case," Callahan had said, his voice steady, his eyes sharp. "Community property laws are clear, and that power of attorney is a trump card. But Martin won't go quietly. Be ready for a fight." I'd nodded, my jaw tight, and left with a copy of the filed motion, its weight in my purse a reminder that I was no longer invisible. Back at the house, I'd packed a small suitcase, clothes, my notebook, a few keepsakes, and checked into a modest hotel in La Jolla. The room was simple, its beige walls and stiff linens a far cry from the estate's opulence, but it felt like freedom. I sat on the bed, my notebook open, and wrote, "I am Lorraine, and I am enough. They thought they could control me, but I've rewritten the script." The words anchored me, a shield against the uncertainty ahead. Martin called that afternoon, his number flashing on my phone like a warning. I let it ring, my heart pounding, until it went to voicemail. His voice was clipped, strained, a far cry from the smooth confidence I'd known. "Lorraine, this has gone far enough. Come home. We can work this out. You're making a mistake." I deleted the message, my finger steady, and turned off the phone. He wasn't pleading. He was grasping, a man scrambling for control he no longer had. Rachel texted next, her words a jumble of anger and desperation. "How could you do this to us? Elliot's asking why you're gone. Please, just talk to Dad." I read it twice, my chest aching for the boy I'd helped raise, but I didn't reply. Rachel's tears were real, but they were also a tactic, a way to pull me back into the role they'd written for me. I wasn't falling for it again. The next day, I met Callahan at a cafe near his office, the air thick with the scent of espresso and fresh pastries. He slid a folder across the table, his expression grim. "Martin's lawyers responded," he said. "They're claiming the power of attorney was signed under duress, that you manipulated him into it. They're also pushing for mediation, hoping to settle out of court." I sipped my coffee, the bitterness grounding me. "Duress?" I said, my voice low, a spark of anger flaring. "I was his wife, not his captor. He signed it willingly, then forgot it existed. What else are they saying?" Callahan's eyes softened, but his tone was firm. "They're painting you as unstable, Lorraine, a disgruntled spouse overreacting to a family decision. They're trying to discredit you, make the court doubt your motives." I leaned back, my hands clasped to keep them still. The words stung, but they weren't surprising. Martin had always been a master of narrative, twisting truths to fit his needs. But this time, he was scrambling, his script unraveling. "Let them try," I said, my voice steady. "I have the documents, the law, and the truth. They can't rewrite me anymore." Callahan nodded, a faint smile breaking through his reserve. "Good. We'll counter with evidence of the trust draft. Your exclusion was deliberate, and we'll request financial records to show how the estate's been managed. If Martin's been hiding assets, it'll weaken his case." I left the cafe with a renewed sense of purpose, the folder tucked under my arm. The streets of La Jolla were alive with tourists, their laughter a distant hum as I walked to the beach. The ocean stretched before me, its waves crashing against the shore, a rhythm that matched the fire in my chest. I stood at the water's edge, the salt air sharp in my lungs, and let myself feel the weight of what I'd done. I'd stood up, not just for the house, but for me, for the woman I'd forgotten how to be. That evening, I turned my phone back on, bracing for more messages. There was one from Diana, her voice soft but laced with condescension. "Lorraine, this is getting out of hand. You're hurting everyone, especially Rachel. Let's meet and find a solution, for the family's sake." I deleted it without hesitation. Diana's charm was a trap, a way to pull me back into the shadows. I wasn't falling for it. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote, "Martin thought he could control the story, but he's lost the pen. They're scrambling now, grasping for a script that doesn't exist." The words flowed, a release of the anger and fear I'd carried too long. I wrote about the wedding, the shock on their faces, the way Martin's control had cracked. I wrote about the hotel room, the ocean, the woman I was becoming. And as I wrote, I felt a clarity I hadn't known was possible. The next morning, I called Callahan to confirm our strategy. "Push for the financial records," I said, my voice firm. "If Martin's been hiding anything, I want it exposed. No more secrets." He agreed, and I hung up, my heart steady. The fight was far from over, but I was ready. As I stepped out of the hotel, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the street. I walked to a nearby park, my notebook in hand, and sat on a bench, watching families laugh and play. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged, not to them, but to myself. Martin was out of moves, his control slipping through his fingers. And as I opened my notebook to write again, a new question took shape, bold and defiant. What will he do when he realizes he's lost me for good? Martin's world was crumbling, and I was no longer the silent wife picking up the pieces. The court papers were filed, the trust frozen, and my truth laid bare. I'd walked away from the estate, from their lies, but I carried my strength with me. As I stood in my new space, the documents my anchor, a final question burned. What does it mean to build a home when you've already claimed yourself? The San Diego summer softened into a gentle warmth, the air carrying the faint salt of the ocean. I'd settled into a small apartment in La Jolla, its white walls and hardwood floors a blank canvas compared to the estate's opulence. The space was modest, a single bedroom, a kitchen with a view of a quiet street, but it was mine. No trays to carry, no orders to follow, no shadows to fade into. I'd hung a simple print of the ocean on the wall, its blues a reminder of the freedom I'd fought for. The folder of documents sat on a shelf, no longer hidden, a testament to my victory. It had been 2 weeks since I'd left the estate. 2 weeks since Martin's last desperate voicemail. The legal battle was in motion, but the momentum was mine. Mr. Callahan had uncovered more than I'd expected. Financial records showing Martin had siphoned funds from the estate's accounts, funneling them into Rachel's trust without my knowledge. "This strengthens your case," Callahan had said, his voice steady over the phone. "It's fraud, plain and simple. The court won't look kindly on it." I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming beside me, and opened my notebook. The pages were filled with my story, years of silence, the wedding's explosion, the fight for my place. Now, I wrote something new. I am Lorraine, keeper of my own home, writer of my own story. They thought they could erase me, but I've built something they can't touch. The words flowed, a quiet celebration of the woman I'd become. Martin's lawyers had pushed for mediation, a last-ditch effort to salvage his control. I'd agreed, not out of weakness, but strategy. The meeting was set for today, in a sterile conference room downtown. I dressed carefully, a navy dress, simple but sharp, my hair pulled back, my eyes clear. The mirror showed a woman who'd shed the weight of others' expectations. I slipped the documents into my purse, alongside my notebook, and drove to the meeting, the ocean sparkling to my left, a reminder of what I'd gained. The conference room was cold, its glass walls reflecting the tension inside. Martin sat across from me, his suit impeccable but his face haggard, lines etched deeper than I remembered. Rachel was there, her eyes red, her hands twisting a tissue. Diana was absent, her absence a silent admission of defeat. Callahan sat beside me, his presence a steady anchor. Martin's lawyer, a sleek man with a practiced smile, spoke first. "We're here to find a resolution," he said. Mr. Thompson is willing to offer a settlement, generous considering the circumstances. I leaned back, my hands clasped, my gaze steady. Generous? I said, my voice calm but edged. You mean a payoff to make me disappear? I'm not here for your money. I'm here for what's mine. Martin's eyes met mine, a flicker of the old charm buried under exhaustion. Lorraine, he said, his voice softer, almost pleading. This doesn't have to be a war. We can split the estate, share the assets. You're still part of this family. I laughed, a low, bitter sound that silenced the room. Family? I said, my voice rising, each word deliberate. You stopped being my family when you wrote me out of the trust, when you let Rachel call me Maid, when you brought Diana in to replace me. I'm not your wife anymore, Martin. I'm the woman who owns half this house, and I'm not settling for less. Rachel's voice broke in, trembling but sharp. You're destroying us, she said, tears spilling. Elliot doesn't understand why you're gone. Why can't you just take the money and leave? I turned to her, my heart aching for the boy, but not for her. I'm not destroying you, Rachel, I said, my voice firm. You destroyed me, bit by bit, every time you treated me like I didn't matter. I'm done carrying your guilt. I'm keeping what's mine, not for revenge, but because I've earned it. Martin's lawyer shifted, his smile faltering. Miss Thompson, be reasonable. Litigation is costly, time-consuming. A settlement benefits everyone. Callahan interjected, his voice sharp. Your client committed fraud, counselor. The financial records show unauthorized transfers. We're prepared to take this to trial, and the court will see it our way. Ms. Thompson isn't settling for less than her legal share. The room fell silent, the air thick with defeat. Martin's shoulders slumped, his hands flat on the table, his control gone. Rachel's sobs were quiet, her tissue shredded in her lap. I stood, my purse in hand, and looked at them one last time. I didn't want this fight, I said, my voice steady. But you left me no choice. I'm not your servant anymore. I'm the keeper of my own home. I walked out, the glass doors closing behind me, the city's hum welcoming me back. The drive to my apartment was quiet, the ocean a steady companion on my left. I felt no joy, only a deep, unshakable peace. The estate was still in limbo, but I'd already won something greater, myself. That evening, I sat on my balcony, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. My notebook lay open, a new page waiting. I wrote, I am Lorraine, not their wife, not their maid, but the woman who built a home from the ashes of their lies. They thought they could break me, but I've risen stronger. The words were a vow, a promise to the life I was creating. The legal battle would continue, but I was ready. Martin had no script left, no way to pull me back. And as I watched the stars emerge, a new question settled, calm and certain. What will I build now that I'm finally free? I'd reclaimed my voice, my home, and myself, leaving Martin and Rachel to face the ruins of their own making. The estate was no longer a cage, but a symbol of my strength, its keys now in my hands. As I stood in my new life, free from their shadows, one final question lingered, soft but clear. What does it mean to live for myself after all I've won? The San Diego autumn was gentle, the air crisp with the promise of change. My apartment in La Jolla had become a sanctuary, its walls adorned with small touches of me. A seashell from the beach, a watercolor I'd painted on a quiet Sunday, a shelf of books I'd finally had time to read. The folder of documents, once a weapon, now rested in a locked drawer, its power no longer needed. The legal battle had ended, not with a dramatic trial, but a quiet settlement that gave me what was mine. Half the estate's value, enough to secure my future, and the right to walk away on my terms. I'd sold my share to a developer, a decision that felt like shedding a final weight. The estate, with its roses and chandeliers, was no longer my home. It was a chapter I'd closed. The money sat in a new account, untouched for now, a resource for the life I was building. I'd kept my notebook, its pages filled with my story, a record of the woman who'd risen from silence to strength. It was my anchor, my proof that I'd survived. Martin had faded from my life, his calls and messages stopping after the settlement. Callahan had heard through legal circles that he'd moved to a smaller house, his empire diminished, his charm no longer enough to hold it together. Rachel had sent one letter, a brief note tucked into an envelope with no return address. "I'm sorry," it read, "for everything." I'd held it for a long moment, my heart heavy for Elliot, but I didn't reply. Some bridges were better left unbuilt. Diana was gone, her absence a silent victory. I'd learned she'd returned to her old life, her role in the family no longer needed. I felt no anger toward her, only a distant pity. She'd been a pawn in Martin's game, just as I'd once been. But I wasn't a pawn anymore. I was Lorraine, keeper of my own story. Today I stood on the balcony of my apartment, a mug of chamomile tea warming my hands. The ocean stretched before me, its waves a steady rhythm, a reminder of the world beyond the estate's walls. I wore a soft sweater, its color a vibrant blue that matched the sky, a choice made for me, not them. The city hummed below, alive with possibility, and I felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. I opened my notebook, its leather cover worn from months of use, and turned to a fresh page. The pen moved slowly at first, then, with a quiet certainty, I am Lorraine, not a wife, not a maid, but a woman who chose herself. I fought for my place, not to destroy them, but to save me. And now, I live for the days ahead, for the home I build with my own hands. The words were a benediction, a closing of the story I'd lived and a beginning of something new. I thought of the estate one last time, not with longing but with gratitude. It had been my battleground, the place where I'd learned to stand. I'd walked away, not because I'd lost, but because I'd won something greater, the right to define my own worth. The money from the settlement was a tool, not a tether. I'd started volunteering at a local women's shelter, sharing my story in quiet moments, helping others find their voice. It wasn't grand, but it was enough. The phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Callahan, his voice warm. "Just checking in," he said. "The final papers are signed. You're officially free." I smiled, the word free settling like sunlight. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, "for everything." I hung up and stepped back onto the balcony, the ocean breeze cool against my skin. The notebook lay open, its final page a promise. I didn't need to write anymore. The story was complete. I closed it gently, my fingers lingering on the cover, and looked out at the horizon. The future was mine, not a script written by others, but a canvas I'd paint myself. I thought of Martin, Rachel, Diana. Their faces faded now, like photographs left too long in the sun. They'd tried to erase me, but I'd rewritten the ending. And as I stood there, the waves crashing below, a final truth settled, calm and unshakable. I am home, not in a house, but in myself.